What's going on, guys? In this video, I'm going to be going over the winners of the Dreamhack from both EU and NA East from the semifinals and the finals. Unfortunately, I'm not covering the heats because there's no replay files available for these. I'm going to start with the finals, and that's going to be Teak from EU, and then I'm going to go into Stretch from NA East. Then I'm going to move on to the semis, where Rezon won EU and Frist won NA East. In the finals, Teak landed at pristine point all 8 games, and he was uncontested for every single game. His looting path was first to land on the roof of the southeast house, then move up to the northeast house, drop down the back to harvest some of the rock for the hard materials here, and then finally loot the house that has the 3 chests. After this, he disengaged to harvest some metal along the road and continued to rotate from there on. Teak had a very typical finals playstyle, where he would fight off spawn if necessary. Obviously he was uncontested every game here, so that wasn't an issue. Avoid as many fights as possible in the mid game, only taking fights if he had a real advantage, and then get the majority of his eliminations in the end game. I think Teak's playstyle is something that a lot of people can learn from because he most importantly didn't land at Mythic POI. There are 2 main takeaways that I got from his gameplay. The first one is from game 1. Remember, there's only 7 chests in his drop spot, so there isn't a great amount to work with here. He got up to 100 HP from these chests, but only had 1 big pot remaining to help him through the rest of the game. He tried his best to find more shields through other people's loot paths going through other POIs, but unfortunately he wasn't able to get anything at all, and that's just going to happen in these stacked finals games. So at this point, it looks like he's going to be going into the mid and end game with 1 big pot as his entire heals, and this certainly is not enough. What Teak should have done in this situation was actually increase his level of aggression a little bit and take a mid or early game fight to try and ensure that he could get an impact frag to get some shields from this. You just simply cannot play the entire game with 1 big pot unless you are really lucky. So it's worth trying to take the fight to ensure you get the impact frag. He also could have taken a harpoon in this situation, which would have allowed him to snag up more loot or fish in the mid game to ensure that he had sufficient heals to make it through the rest of the game. This is applicable to a lot of people because being scuffed is something that's super common, and just knowing when to take a fight and when not to is going to be really important in your games. The other thing I learned about this, which all revolved around the drop spot as well, is that Teak highly valued taking crash pads. A lot of players in the Dreamhack finals consistently took crash pads to their inventory, and this can really get you far in the moving zones. Having these crash pads definitely negates any of the negative RNG revolved around not having a launch pad, so they're 100% worth taking, in particular if you don't have a launch pad. In Teak's endgame, in the first moving, he was always looking to reuse a launch pad first. However, if he couldn't get one of these and he didn't have one of his own, he would set up this crash pad within his box. Depending on which direction he wanted to go, if he wanted to go diagonal, you could set up a cone edit like this, so where you're fully boxed up, edit the cone into a Dorito, open the floor above you so that you're safe inside the cone to get you a little bit higher up within the box, and then simply throw the crash pad down and it'll throw you out of the box. You're completely safe while you do this, and you don't need to do any awkward ramp rotates either. If you don't need to go diagonal, you can just do this with a ramp as well. Then when he landed, he boxed up, looked back, went for eliminations with his assault rifle this way, and then repeated the process until he ran out of crash pads. This saved him a large amount of materials, and this is definitely one of the benefits that crash pads have over peppers, is that while you're peppering, you still need to be using your materials. However, when you're using crash pads, you really only need to use these when you land. In less stacked games, it is more likely that you're going to get beamed out of the sky when you're using a crash pad. However, Teak barely ever took any damage while using the crash pads at all. However, his games obviously were very stacked. Next up from the finals is Stretch, who won the NA East region. His drop is Misty Meadows, and he lands on the west side of this, looting the kind of middle houses here. Stretch's consistency was pretty insane, so that's definitely what I'm going to be focusing on mainly here. The majority of the reasoning for this was its fantastic rotations. It was clear that Stretch had already pre-planned out his early game rotations, his mid game rotations, and his late game rotations. Whenever a zone popped up, he already knew exactly what he was doing and had already planned in advance where to go. This is particularly important because a lot of people don't do this in the end game. A lot of people have this plan for the early game, so they know if the zone goes over here, we're going to rotate this way. If the zone goes over here, we're going to rotate that way. But they really fail to do this in the end game, and this is something that Stretch does really well. You can see in the background clip here that Stretch is already preparing for a max distance zone by tunneling ahead a little bit of the zone. This puts him ahead of other players and gives himself a little bit more time to rotate, which he does using minimal materials. If you stay at the edge as soon as you get into a zone, it's going to give you less time to rotate as the zone's going to be right on your back, and there's going to be more players where you are, which means there's going to be a higher chance of you fighting one of these players or being eliminated and stuck in zone. In your endgames, you need to be slightly ahead of the zone to ensure that you have enough time to think about your next rotate. Once you've gotten into the zone and you're waiting for that next zone to show, think about all of the options that you can do when that zone appears so that you're more prepared for when it actually does. Another thing that Stretch does really well is his dead side rotates. I have a full video up covering dead side rotates, so go watch that if you want to learn more about this topic. However, in particular, Stretch does this really well again in the end game. Notice how in this game he's just gotten into the 5th zone and he's currently sitting in the most congested side of the zone. This is going to make his next rotate really difficult because when that next zone shows, he's probably going to have to fight through a lot of players to be able to actually start rotating and already going to waste a lot of materials. He has one launch pad and he's probably going to try to use it here on his first zone moving. However, if there's a large amount of players around him, there's a huge chance that he may get blocked while he's trying to do this and completely scuff up his entire end game. So to counter this, Stretch goes to the dead side of the zone. And in the 5th zone, he's ensuring that he's kind of close to the middle because you don't want to be too far away from all the players or you'll get focused. This gives him much more space to rotate from the next time, and it makes his next launch pad really easy. He only commits 14 builds to doing this, however it ensures that he's much safer on his next rotate. He does this a lot in his endgame, and while rotating he always manages to get to the edge and away from the largest amount of players, which enables him to rotate using the minimal materials. This was a huge key to his success once he got into the endgame to ensure that he got much further. Over in the EU semis, Rezon placed first. His drop was Holly Hedges, and it was often contested by at least 3 people every single game. He lands at Doghouse, which gives him the best chance to get the most loot because there's 3 chests here, and the majority of other places only have 1 and some have 2. Rezon isn't overly concerned about fighting in the early game, but definitely does take fights here or there. His main strategy really is just to disengage and to try get an advantage on some of the players who have dropped at these more poverty routes, as he knows some of these players will probably be not as good fighters and won't have as good loot. One of the things that I always suggest people to do is to get as many hard materials off of spawn as possible. In particular metal, because a lot of this is really difficult to farm later on in the game. Interestingly, Rezon nearly always left with only around 100 metal, but good wood and brick, despite the fact there still being a lot of cars to harvest here. This showed that he really was just trying to disengage as quickly as possible from his drop spot, and didn't want to risk taking a fight to harvest that little bit of metal. Instead, Rezon had mapped out on his looting path exactly where he was going to get the metal from once he'd left his POI. Because he landed Holly Hedges, if he had to rotate south, there was a huge amount of metal down to the south near the water side here, which you could easily sit and farm from in a very safe area. If you're planning on leaving your drop spot without full hard materials, you have to plan where you're going to harvest these on your rotates, and ensure you've planned these for each possibility of zone 2. Something very small but apparent that I kept noticing in Rezon's endgames is that he was always focusing the guys who had the mythic weapons. If he ever saw someone use the grapple or use the shockwave, he was always ensuring that he was spraying at them as much as he possibly could. These players are by far the strongest players in the lobby because they have the broken and almost unlimited mobility, so ensuring that you're focusing on these guys will firstly potentially eliminate these players for you, enabling you to get these mythic items, which basically ensures you a top 5 finish. Or if you're height, you can actually spray down and ensure them from griefing your game so that you can keep height more. A large amount of players won their games purely because they got lucky and killed the guy who had the shockwave launcher. If you're actively focusing on where these 2 mobility items are, you're drastically increasing your chances of winning the game. So finally, from the NA East semis, our winner was Frist. He was the only one out of these 4 players who dropped at a mythic item spot, and he dropped at Catty Corner. As I discussed in my early game video, Frist knows exactly how to drop. He always aligned himself up to get to the floor spawn that was on the roof in the back corner, and his drop was always perfect for it. Because he always had a better drop than everyone else, this turned the 50-50 that this place normally is to in his favour, as he gets the gun first, which allows him to beam other players and win more consistently off spawn, which is something that he did really well in this round. First, poverty tarping in the endgame is something I've actually seen a lot of pro players do recently, but I'm not really sure I've seen anyone talk about it. While doing the floor ramp poverty stair tarp, a lot of players end up getting underneath the ramp, phasing it, and can be easily shot from behind. The way that Frist counters this is to place in the floor and the ramp the tile in front of you, rather than on the tile that you're standing on, like most people would do it. This allows it A, to not phase over your head accidentally, and B, it protects you for a longer amount of time. This does take a little bit of practicing creative, because you need to be very specific on where you're pointing your crosshair to ensure that the ramp goes in the right direction. If you don't, you're just going to place the ramp in the wrong angle and then you can't go underneath it. So ensure that you're practicing this specific way of doing this, as it'll keep you protected for a minimum amount of materials. Using the shockwave launcher, Frist continually tried to take height on the second moving zone. It's going to be really difficult for a lot of players to take it because a lot of the times the height is only taken by the shockwave launcher, and since he already has it on height, that's not an issue for him. If zone's really far, he can also just use one more shockwave to get to the other side of it and then build up again just to ensure that he has height. Just like many players now we're seeing on height, he's only using a single floor or cone to tarp on here. This most importantly saves some materials and gets him further into the end game. Yes, it's easier to be shot out, however, if you have the shockwave launcher, it's still really easy to take height back again. Even if you don't have the shockwave launcher, this is still a really good idea in solos, and this is something we're seeing a lot of the pros do now, is not overcommit to height. The materials you save from this will 100% help you if you get shot down, so you can either build back up again, or just continue to tarp from a reasonably high or mid-ground layer. This is something we saw Janus do a lot in the FNCS Invitational, where he would just take height and then just go on a single cone, just ensuring he wasn't wasting any materials. Then as soon as he gets shot down, he just continues to tarp underneath. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned a lot. Thank you for the support. I've hit 10k on YouTube, which is pretty awesome. Lots of great content coming with Dreamhack just being over. This weekend we have Dreamhack for the NA West region, and then FNCS starts after that, so expect a ton of solo content coming. I'm doing viewing parties of FNCS on my Twitch on the weekends and VOD reviews throughout the weeks, so go and follow me there if you want to catch any of that stuff. Hope you guys have a good day. I'll catch you later. See you!